Bueno, buenos días a todos.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the academic conference on journalist safety. I will be speaking in Spanish. Perhaps I might put in a word or two in English. The idea here is that everybody will make a presentation on the research, and we'll have 10 minutes for each presenter. And for the sake of organization, as a lot of people are connected online, we will try to follow the same procedure as the previous session, and as it appears on the agenda. Here with me, I've got Desiree Hill. I apologize in advance if I mispronounce the name, but we will also have Miriam Gersamia, Maya Toradze, Giver Willem Celestine, Lada Prize, Ola Ongunyemi, and we will also have Maya Simonjak. So let's start now with Desiree Hill. The floor is yours.
I think I'll stay seated. We have a nice, intimate group. And so my topic, and I'm going to set my timer also so that I don't go over on my second. So my topic and what I am interested in studying is the subject of journalism and trauma. I've studied it from several perspectives, but I just keep finding new things that I want to learn about the topic. And so my newest area that I want to study is journalism students and trauma. So the research I'm about to present involves, the title you can see here is Campus News Coverage of an Execution, a Narrative Analysis. So we already know in our literature that journalists will experience trauma in their work. That's fairly settled. But there is almost no research that exists on what college students who are journalists will experience if they experience a traumatic event. So what I am doing is focusing on students who covered an execution or several topics surrounding execution in the state of Oklahoma, which is where we are located. And what you can see on the screen actually is a freeze frame of two of the student journalists on the day of one of the coverages. Behind them, you can see the gurney where the person is strapped in and executed. And this was important for a couple of reasons. The first reason, this coverage was notable because in the first case, our state of Oklahoma had halted executions for a period of years, and they were no longer done. But suddenly, the Supreme Court ruled on a Thursday that executions could go forward. And yes, an execution was going to be scheduled in 2 hours. And so our students had to come in and start working on this coverage very suddenly, almost unexpectedly for them. And so it was quite shocking. The person was actually put to death just minutes before our live newscast went on the air. So the students were reading the words and processing and learning about this topic. And the second execution was notable because it involved sort of a celebrity case where celebrities had aligned behind this person and the person had repeatedly declared his innocence. So students were very closely aligned with that particular story. And what happened was, because this is an area I'm interested in, and you're going to hear some of my colleagues in a few minutes from JETREG, Journalism Education Trauma Research Group, we're focused on the topic of university education and trauma. So here I was as the newscast advisor in the middle of this with my students, thinking, I better do something because this is my area of research. I'd better put my money where my mouth is. And so the first thing we did was we brought in counselors to start to help the students walk through this. And that's part of what this research is going to detail. So let me just give you a little bit of literature on this topic. So the studies show that anywhere from 4 to 60% of journalists will experience trauma in their work, or PTSD to be more specific. The numbers vary because it depends on who you're studying. If you're studying war journalists, the number will be higher than if you're studying local journalists who maybe experience less traumatic events. We also know through all this is research driven, that journalists will experience a number of different types of things, such as secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, burnout as a result of their work. And for a lot of journalists, what the research shows is sometimes the earliest trauma experience is among the most memorable. People will remember decades later that first story they covered in which they had a traumatic reaction. We also know that, interestingly enough, that a lot of people would think, well, it's the big stories that are traumatic. It's terror attacks, it's natural disasters, but it doesn't really matter. It can be a fatal car accident that maybe no one paid attention to, that a journalist covered, that was the moment for them that they suffered some emotional trauma. Something else that's really important to keep in mind, some of the newer research is showing us that you don't have to leave the newsroom to have symptoms of PTSD. So studies have started to occur looking at people who just edit video, for example. They don't leave the newsroom, they don't go to the war zone, they don't go to the shooting, but they see the video over and over and over again, and therefore they can also be traumatized. Now my study, at the top you can see that I used narrative inquiry as my method. I studied the dozen journalists who covered this, worked on this execution coverage, which means I did semi-structured interviews with each of them, and then I coded the data until we came upon 4 research questions and findings. So at the beginning, what I was really interested in was how do they describe their experience in their own words? What did it feel like to be a young journalist with your first trauma experience? And so some of the quotes I have here you can see. They felt numb. They felt selfish because they had guilt feelings of, well, it's not all about me, but I'm feeling these feelings and I don't want to make it about me. Another person described herself as in a dream state with these unexpected emotions that she was feeling. The second research question dealt with the counseling intervention that we did. What was that experience for these journalists? And overwhelmingly positive reaction among the students. In the counseling experience, they learned mindfulness exercises. They had a therapy dog that came in that they could touch and pet. They also experienced peer support. And that we know is very healing for journalists, is that collegial support. And they also just said, thank you for offering it. Thank you for doing this. A couple of people could not attend due to their schedules, and they said, I still love that you did it. I still have a positive reaction. The other question was, what suggestions do you have for us as students back to college, university setting and training? And I thought what was interesting here was they were thinking like a professional journalist and saying some of the same things that professional journalists have said. And that is that professional journalists want counselors who are trained in journalism culture. If you don't understand journalism culture, it is really hard to counsel journalists, because the number one thing to do to remove trauma for journalists is remove yourself from the trauma. Well, you can't do that if you're a journalist, right? You got to do the work. The students also wanted more emotional check-ins. They said, thank you for doing this, and it was great that we could talk about this, but let's do it more often. Let's just ask each other how we're doing on a regular basis. Let's make that part of our newsroom culture. And finally, what I was interested in is how do you think this is going to affect you as you go into your professional work? And they said that they described it as real-world experience. That was important to them. And they felt like they learned how to help others through this process. So they believed that they would carry this training, a very small bit of training, into their professional work. So bottom line here, this research connects to previous studies of journalism and trauma, because the feelings of being numb, feelings of being in a dreamlike state, that is what professional journalists say when they are traumatized. The other connection is that these journalists were not necessarily in the field for this story, but they felt a lot of uncomfortable emotions, which is what the literature says. They had a positive response to the counseling. So one important thing to note on the counseling was it was not mandatory. It was optional. So you want to make sure, from some previous research I've done, you do not want to force counseling on people. It should be their choice to get it. So a couple of key points before I wrap up. Key point number one is, of course, the trauma training has to begin at the earliest stages of journalism training. It has to start as soon as possible in the earliest classes. Key point number two, my final point, is that this research connects to what we already know is needed overall in the industry. We need more training. We need more attention to the topic of journalism and trauma. What happens when we train journalists early? Well, it means that they're going to take these expectations into the workplace. So many of the workplaces they're going to enter will not have any kind of intervention, any kind of training, anything like that. But they're going to have that expectation. They are going to be the future leaders, and that is how we will affect change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Desiree. Now we're going with Mariam Guarsamea and Maya Toraste. Please, start when you want.
Do you hear my voice?
Yeah.
Oh, I hear my echo. Okay, that's fine. Yes. First of all, thank you for the opportunity given to us. And in the very beginning, I'd like to express my condolences towards the journalists, fallen heroes in Ukraine. I'm Professor Mariam Guarsamea from Georgia, the chairwoman of Media and Communication Educational and Research Center. And let me introduce my co-author, Associated Professor Maya Toradze, Senior Fellow at MCRC. So, research entitled Media Environment and Safety of Journalists During the Crisis in Georgia, Threats and Supportive Instruments is conducted by this organization with support of Friedrich Naumann Foundation's South Caucasus Office and Germany's Federal Foreign Office. I want to thank them also. This research was triggered by the actualization of the spontaneous media threat that arose during the pre-election period in Georgia. More specifically, 2 months before Georgia's local self-government and municipal elections, media workers fell victim to an attack by pro-Russian radical groups during the coverage of demonstrations. As a result, 52 journalists, cameramen, and photographers were assaulted, and one cameraman, Lexo Lashkarava, died. Challenges seen from the perspective of the safety of journalists garnered an unprecedented level of international attention and stimulated the research in this field. So in general, 30 years after the collapse of Soviet Union and gaining the independence, safety of journalists while carrying their professional duties continues to be one of the key indicators of what constitutes progress in our country's media democracy. For now, 20% of Georgia's territory is still occupied by Russia, and we face constantly the malign influence of Russian propaganda and hybrid warfare in media environment included, which damages media environment and democratization of this process. The aim of the research was to identify threats prevalent to the media environment, online and offline, during the times of crisis, and even more specifically during pre- and post-election periods, because we know that the threats are more visible during the crisis. The research also responds to the question of how political polarization and crisis affect media and the macro and micro threats they reveal. And research covers topics recommended by UNESCO and examines 7 of the 10 recommended issues. So it was the mixed methodological approach. It was conducted in 2 phases. First, the first phase involved accumulation of quantitative data, or the survey of journalists about the threats they see. And in the second phase, we have conducted the qualitative research, the focus group discussions. So to go to the findings, because we don't have much time, presenting the media as an institution and maintaining its viability remains an important challenge for Georgia and for the transitional democracy. The research confirmed that challenges in the media environment are especially active during the pre-election period because of political polarization and because politicians and parties are trying to press the journalists and to control the flow of information. During the research process, 4 macro and 6 micro media threats were identified. These threats reinforce self-censorship and fear, the aim of which is to replace critical questions with silence. Threats negatively affect demonstration of solidarity and support toward media because they reduce media credibility, access to the sources, and in general weaken the viability of media institution. Polarization has a so-called demonizing effect that can be manifested through the stigmatization of journalists by politicians, political labeling, and which ultimately hurts, of course, the media. The research confirmed that the ruling political force in Georgia uses all the components and mechanisms required to create and strengthen self-censorship of journalists. And these mechanisms are fear, impunity for crime, discrediting, insecurity, dissemination of misinformation about journalists. Enhancing journalist self-censorship creates an invisible field of censorship in the newsrooms, when for security reasons, the journalists are forced to avoid covering specific topics, sources, or facts. In the run-up of the elections in Georgia, journalists are particularly at risk of physical and verbal violence, online and offline. And the media workers mainly associate direct and indirect forms of violence to the anti-Western, pro-Russian groups, and purposeful governmental policies that aim to stigmatize the media and paint the media in the light of the enemy and to reduce public trust in the media. And the alarming environment created in Georgia reminds media workers of the attitudes toward journalists in Russia, in Belarus, and other authoritarian countries in general. And study find out that media pressure tactics and systematic approaches may be seen as an effect of Russian propaganda and malign influence as well. In general, research has shown that the extent to which journalists feel safe in their professional work is one of the components of assessing the quality of democracy in the country. Our findings include recommendations on creating safe and supportive media environment. For example, just to create these positive moments of solidarity toward journalists, media solidarity demonstrations have been assessed as a mechanism that can transform the media environment in a positive way. And we have started today a very positive campaign to build the supportive media environment in Georgia. And I will show you just one slide of this. And it's also very important to raise public awareness about the role and need of critical media in Georgia. The discussion showed that in this regard, face-to-face communications and meeting with audience are useful and appropriate. And once again, thanks to UNESCO, to our organization, and again, Friedrich Naumann Foundation's South Caucasus office for their support. And I would like just to show you very, very briefly, that is what I mean. Today we have started the campaign where we post the cards of journalists when they write, "I'm a journalist, therefore," and they write their message, or "I'm a journalist because," and they write the message. So they write, "Therefore I say the truth," or "Therefore I speak out what I see," "Therefore I know what the price of the freedom, why it's so important," etc., etc. And we of course try to show the support and to create these solidarity moments for journalists as well. And it can, as the previous presenter also mentioned, it's very important to build this resilience in everyday life of journalists, because they are really working in a very stressful environment, especially in the regions where democracy is fragile and especially in the crisis period. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much for your participation here. Well, we continue with Gever Verlumen Celestine. Are you there?
Can you hear me? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Gavi Velman Celestine from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. I am a lecturer with the Department of Mass Communication of the institution. I thank UNESCO and the government of Uruguay for giving me this opportunity to share the result of my study on a topic that I am very passionate about. I will be presenting my findings on the topic, modeling the safety challenges that Nigerian journalists faced in covering protest by the indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB, the moderating role of gender and ownership. Nigeria is a very complex country made up of over 300 ethnic groups, and these groups are all clamoring to ensure that they are represented in the power sharing of the Nigerian government. Lately, we have had cases of growing agitation championed by the indigenous people of Biafra, clamoring for the creation of the Republic of Biafra as a way of addressing the perceived imbalance in the political power sharing of the country. This group has continued to organize protests, both online and offline. They have engaged in several activities, and Nigerian journalists have been at the heart of ensuring that people get up-to-date information on activities of the group. In the course of doing this, media workers are exposed to different safety challenges. The study was a survey of 400 journalists from both private and government organizations. The results of my findings show that both journalists from private and public organizations are faced with both online and offline safety challenges like verbal abuse, physical attack, harassment, among others. I found further that ownership and gender significantly moderate the safety challenges that Nigerian journalists face. For example, why men are likely to face offline challenges than women. Put together, male journalists are likely to face safety challenges than their male counterpart. I mean, female journalists. Female journalists are likely to face safety challenges than their male counterpart. With regards to ownership pattern, both journalists from private and public media outfits face safety challenges. However, journalists from public media organizations face online challenges, while their counterpart from private organizations face offline challenges. Put together, journalists from private media outfits face safety challenges than their counterpart in government outfits. My results also show that there are some facilitating conditions that could increase vulnerability or reduce vulnerability to safety challenges. Some of the facilitating conditions include training on security consciousness, training on security alertness, safety consciousness, use of modern technology, and most importantly, political will. The Nigerian political class do not see journalists as partners in progress. Rather, journalists are perceived as people who are bent at revealing some of the atrocities that are being committed by the officials of government. Therefore, it is my strong suggestion that in considering policies and programs that will make the work environment safer for Nigerian journalists to enable them continue to serve as the voice for the voiceless, there should be an improvement in political will by the Nigerian political class. It is also my suggestion that when considering policies and programs, aimed at addressing the safety challenges that journalists in Nigeria face. Special consideration should be given to gender as well as ownership. Women journalists should be specifically given consideration, considering that they are more vulnerable to safety challenges than their male counterparts. Additionally, special attention needs to be given to journalists in government media, in private media outfits, because they face safety challenges than their counterparts in government media outfits. Once again, I thank you for your attention, and I thank UNESCO for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to more of these collaborations with a view to presenting empirical evidence from a point of view of Nigeria regarding the safety challenges that journalists are facing. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Gever. Now we're going with Lada Price and Ola Ugeniemin. Are you there?
Hello, thank you. Can you see my screen? And yeah. Hello, everybody, and thank you again for inviting us here this important conference. Today, I'm going to present the findings from a study that I conducted together with Dr. Ola Ogunemi, who's also here, so it's a joint presentation. We are both leaders of the Journalism Education Trauma Research Group. Just in case you're not familiar with our work, the group was set up and launched in 2020. And since then, for the past 2 years, we have managed to grow from a very small network of scholars to a large group of educators, researchers, and journalists in over 33 countries. I think we have more than 200 members now, and these members are based in 7 world regions. They do their own research and work, and it's good to see that at least 5 of these researchers actually are presenting today at the academic conference. So today we will talk a little bit about the research that we conducted last year about the awareness of trauma and the barriers to teaching trauma-informed literacy, from findings from a global survey with journalism educators. So to give you a little bit of background first from the literature. So research, studies, existing studies on journalism and trauma clearly show that journalists that constantly cover traumatic events, or perhaps are exposed to traumatic events, whether that's covering more conflict or actually doing some pretty routine work in the newsroom, exposed to images or court cases, or perhaps things like traffic incidents, they suffer emotional and psychological effects of that exposure. And there's actually growing evidence that also shows that most of these journalists feel ill-prepared for such assignments and for such exposure. And as a result, scholars have continued to argue, and beginning to argue more strongly, that exposure to trauma reporting strategies and lesson in higher education can actually foster trauma literate journalists and editors. So it's really important for that to happen, and it's really important for that to start happening in the classroom. However, if we've been through the literature and there's little evidence or little efforts to adopt that transformative pedagogy that incorporates trauma-informed literacy in journalism education, there's quite a few examples of educators doing that. In some instances, in some higher institution, there's also some training, but we need more consistent effort. So we and other researchers from the Journalism Education Trauma Research Group are well positioned to drive the adoption of teaching that incorporates trauma-informed literacy through empirical studies on journalism educators, because their perspective so far is largely missing from the literature. So this consistent and proactive approach requires journalism scholars to focus and to examine the interdisciplinary nature of teaching trauma literacy and that expertise that is needed to provide the journalism curriculum and some training, perhaps, that equips students with knowledge and understanding of trauma-informed literacy that is embedded into learning, teaching, and assessment. So this is the background of our study. What did we do? We had three main research questions. Firstly, do journalism educators actually understand the risks that arise from exposure to traumatizing events? And do they have the skills and the competence to teach trauma literacy? And finally, are there any barriers and what are they to embedding trauma-informed literacy in the curriculum and in teaching? In order to answer these questions, we designed a survey questionnaire to gather data from journalism educators across the world. And we managed to get 129 participants from a number of world regions. We have respondents from Australia, New Zealand, Eastern and Western Europe, Latin America, North Africa, Middle East, North America, Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. And we conducted the study between April and June 2021. We then conducted quantitative and qualitative data analysis using SBS and thematic analysis, which we will present our findings very briefly now. So we won't be able to show you the full result of our study, but we do hope to publish that as a paper in a special issue on trauma literacy in education that is coming up early next year. So firstly, in response to our first research question, it was very encouraging to see that 86.2% of our participants reported that they have a good understanding of the risks that arise from exposure to and potentially traumatizing events. So journalism educators seem to be well aware of those risks of exposure. If you look at figure 2, that shows that 38% of participants report they actually have acquired adequate orientation or some sort of training to teach journalism students about critical and potentially traumatizing events, and also the effect of the reactions such exposures can evoke. So this is not a big percentage, but we also found that most of these educators lack the competence and the confidence to teach trauma literacy. And that came up in the free space, the answers that we gave an opportunity for our participants to give. In relation to our questions about barriers to inclusion of trauma literacy material in the journalism curriculum, we found that the top 3 are lacks of specialist knowledge, lack of resources, and lack of time. So we found that there are some major challenges to embedding trauma-informed literacy in the journalism curriculums in many countries around the world. 87.7% of our participants reported the inclusion of relevant teaching materials can help students become resilient to exposure of trauma. So just a very brief snapshot of the analysis of participant comments that relate to the barriers and challenges to implementing trauma literacy in the curriculum. So alongside lack of awareness and knowledge expertise, there are some differences in each region. So there were things mentioned such as cultural barriers and limited staff. There was also issues of accreditation or authorization from regulatory bodies and resources. There's also lack of training facilities, lack of experience, and lack of time, awareness and resources that were mentioned by our participants. And I will just give finally to my colleague Ola Ogunemi, who will present the conclusions.
Thank you. So we're quite pleased to know that a high proportion of journalism educators actually understand the risk that arise from exposure to traumatizing events. So, which is a very good step to start from. However, it is worrying that most journalism educators stated that they lack the knowledge and the competence to teach trauma. Okay, so that means there is an area there where we can do intervention work. And what we are thinking about is to design a professional development course on trauma-informed literacy for journalism educators. So this is part of the work that JETREC will be embarking on. Then our empirical studies have also shown that we need to produce teaching materials, because if you look at the barriers that was shown to you earlier on, one of the things that journalism educators said was that there is not enough teaching materials to use, even to recommend to students. We need to be producing a lot of that. Then there is also a lack of consensus about what the content of trauma module or course should be. We have some colleagues in North America who have been teaching a lot of it. We have some colleagues in Australia, they've been teaching bits of it, and some in Western Europe, and they are thinking, are we doing the right thing? Is there something missing? So it's because we are not yet, bringing everybody together to discuss what should be, taught and how it should be taught. So definitely there's a lot of things to be done in that area. And also looking at the teaching strategy, because we cannot rely on the standard way of teaching lectures and seminar to teach trauma-informed literacy. It doesn't work that way. So there's a lot of work to do in terms of teaching strategies. And then the barriers to embedding trauma-informed literacy also vary in different regions. So that was shown to you in the penultimate slide, because different areas, depending on accreditation issues in Asia, government has a lot of influence on what is taught. Also in Sub-Saharan Africa, universities are not as independent as they may be in the global north. So there are some issues there and tensions and things like that. So we can really look into that we have regional hubs is very helpful, because they can bring that to the table and tweak it to, at least, relate to their own kind of need in that region. So that's where we are at the moment, and we are marching forward, making sure that we embed informed literacy across the board worldwide, and then journalism students are much more prepared to be able to report trauma. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you so much, Leda and Ole. Now we are going with Maya Samuyak. Maya, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me and can you see the presentation?
Now we can hear you. Only we can hear.
You cannot see my screen?
Now, wait a moment.
Yeah, I can hear her and I can also see her screen.
We're checking.
Okay, I'm on standby.
Okay. Now we're ready.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you, and hi everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Maya Shimunyak. I'm a senior lecturer in journalism at Middlesex University, and I'm the leadership fellow of the Arts and Humanities Research Council. In the next few minutes, I'll aim to outline a tailored approach to developing emotional intelligence and resilience in journalists, kind of similar to what Mariam and Maya were saying that we're missing currently. The motivation to develop this training, and indeed the content of the training itself, is informed by findings from the study that I have conducted with British journalists on the topic of emotional labor that they experience in their everyday work. I have interviewed over 30 journalists from 15 different organizations last year. So several observations from these interviews motivated me to start thinking of developing an approach to building resilience among journalists. In the first place, unsurprisingly perhaps, I found that journalists perceive journalism as an immensely emotional job with significant levels of emotional labor. And this labor is not triggered only by trauma reporting, but also various daily tasks. There's nervousness about approaching sources, anxiety before broadcasts, frustration with long hours, worry about social media audiences, and so on. However, most only come to this conclusion after probing and when given time to reflect on their experiences. My perception is that the journalists find it very hard to talk about their work-related emotions. It's not something that they often or ever do, and they perceive the journalistic culture to still be characterized by this macho, thick-skin narratives, which actually motivates them to ignore their work-related emotions. And this leads them, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, to often being unaware of the emotional situations they face in the job until they lead to severe negative consequences on their mental or physical health. Things like experiencing chronic stress, burnout, depression, but also having impact on the quality of their work. And finally, kind of once they did manage to kind of put into words what it is that is inducing emotional labor and with what kind of consequences, many of the journalists I spoke to said that they would find two things particularly helpful. The first is to be better prepared for what is coming at them, meaning to know what may cause emotional labor in their line of work. And the second thing is to learn how to deal with it. So how to manage their work-related emotions so they do not have a negative effect on their well-being, mental and physical health, as well as job performance and job satisfaction. So to try to do that, I have explored the literature on emotional labor and stress and found that studies from work sociology and psychology suggest that work-related stress can be mitigated with emotional intelligence, which enables workers to effectively manage their emotions, which in turn contributes to development of emotional resilience. Just a note on the definitions. So emotional intelligence is here understood as a skill, actually, a one that enables a person to recognize, understand, and manage own and others' emotions in a way which leads to positive outcomes. So stress relief, effective communication, and so on. And resilience is understood as the ability to cope with the difficulty and bounce back from it. So the logic of the argument is that by developing emotional intelligence, and that is being able to recognize and effectively manage work-related emotions, journalists can be better able to cope with emotional situations that they face in the job and bounce back more easily after experiencing these challenges. And I just want to emphasize that I'm not suggesting that facing emotional situations is an individual level issue that journalists should face alone and on their own. I'm seeing this as one element in a wider support system for journalists. The study found several practices and aspects of journalists' work to be particularly emotionally challenging, and these are the red arrows. There are also several common emotion management strategies that journalists report are effective in managing emotional situations that are tied to these practices. So verbal processing entails speaking about emotions with peers, personal networks, but also things like counseling and therapy. Internal processing means thinking about situations that are triggering emotions and kind of reframing the beliefs and expectations that are leading to upsetting emotions. Boundary setting refers to setting boundaries, which can kind of help either prevent emotional labor or give space to process and to manage emotions. And attentional deployment usually comes in the form of engaging in diverting activities that make one happy. So kind of to balance negative with positive emotions. So the approach that I'm suggesting consists of first briefing journalists about emotional situations they may face, and then secondly, training them in strategies that other journalists have found helpful in a particular emotional situation. So let me give you an example of what I mean with this. When it comes to work with social media, journalists who I have interviewed have identified three most common emotional situations. The first one is the frustration that arises from the pressure to do work with social media. The second is the anxiety and the nervousness about posting content given the perceived negativity of social media spaces. And the third is kind of the frustration and sadness and anxiety and sometimes anger with the received abuse and harassment on these platforms. They have also reported regularly applying these three emotion management strategies. In this context, the most important one seems to be boundary setting. This is a quote from one of the interviewees, but actually a range of strategies that could be considered under boundary setting have been mentioned, kind of turning off notifications, as well as deleting apps from mobile phones and using apps such as TweetDeck and Hootsuite for kind of monitoring content, but not seeing the rest of the social media there. Also, internal processing is popular in this situation. Often this involves perspective taking on social media audiences. So for example, journalists may stop and think about whether those audiences, the abusive ones, are actually their target audiences and whether their voices are representative of those that they aim to represent. And finally, verbal processing with peers and personal networks can help too. We have heard a bit about this in the first presentation. So some who have experienced social media abuse reported gaining an emotional release and support from colleagues by sharing their experiences with them. Now, this can help rationalize the emotional event, and it can also help legitimize emotions in the workplace and their consequences, as the students have said would be a good idea. So to sum up, this approach is based on developing emotional intelligence and consequently also resilience by, on the one hand, signposting to journalists which emotional situations they may face in the job so they can recognize them and be prepared for them. And on the other hand, equipping them with emotion management strategies, which could help them navigate these emotional situations, all with the aim for them to feel and to perform better in the workplace. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Maya. Well, that's all. I want to thank all of you around the world to join us. The Free Hill here in Uruguay. Miriam, Maya, Giver, Lada, Ola, and Maya. So thank you so much.